Hello, and welcome to Art with Miss Michelle. Today we're going to learn about an artist named Claude Monet. Claude Monet was born in 1840 in Paris, France. His father was a grocer, and his mother was a singer. And his dad really wanted him to go into the family grocery business, but he wanted to become an artist. He started his art career drawing charcoal characters of people and selling them. He also went to art school and took one-on-one drawing lessons from an artist. He also met an artist named Eugene Boudin, who became his personal mentor and introduced him to oil painting. And he also introduced him to painting outside, which is called en plein air, which would become Monet's main focus during his art career. Other artists in his class at art school, and many artists during this time all over the world, learned about art by copying famous paintings by the old masters or the artists who people thought were really good at art and were able to paint very realistically. So people wanted to learn by copying their style. But instead of doing this, Monet would sit by the window and paint what he saw outside. He was really inspired by nature, and people thought he was kind of an idiot for doing this when he could be actually learning about how to do art by copying famous artists that painted before him. He luckily did meet some artists in art school that agreed with him and his style. And he worked with lots of other artists, both in school and just in Paris, because there was a lot of artists in Paris during this time. So him and his artist, who he was friends with, would experiment with their new approaches to art. Unfortunately, in 1870, war broke out in France and he fled the country because he didn't feel very safe. He went to England and he continued painting. He did a lot of studying different colors and how to use them. And he tried to enter his art into an exhibition at the Royal Academy, and they turned him down and said, no, we don't think your art is very good because you're not doing the style that we're used to. He traveled around a little bit more and eventually returned to France when he thought it was safe. And he kept doing his style because he didn't really care what the art critics said. And he did have his little group of artists that they all supported each other in their new style. And in 1872, he painted a picture called Impression of a Sunrise. And an art critic thought it was awful, and he called it Impressionism and used the word as a derogatory or a mean term to describe his art. However, the artists really liked that word and they started calling themselves the Impressionists. And that is a term that stuck around and became a famous art movement. He continued painting nature, and most of his work was inspired by nature. His family was able to rent a house with an orchard and a garden, and he just really focused on painting, and he liked to sit out and paint stuff in his garden. He started selling a lot of art, and his luck was really good, and he made enough money to purchase the house. so his family was able to stay there, and they really worked on building up the gardens, and Monet would sit and paint in his gardens. He is most famous for his water lily paintings. He had a nice bridge over water with water lilies that he liked to paint a lot. Some of his paintings are very large. A lot of his work is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and he has whole rooms in that museum with just his giant water lily paintings. So he was successful during his lifetime, but he has continued to be a very celebrated artist. He did paint from nature, but his style of Impressionism, he kind of focused more, in my opinion, on like the shapes and colors than necessarily like trying to create a hard line outline of the objects or things he was painting. So it's a very loose and flowy style that went really well with his subject matter of nature and water lilies. He continued painting for his whole life, and in 1926 he died from lung cancer, sadly, and he didn't want people to make a big deal over his death, so he had a small funeral, but his house was left to an artist organization, and they have continued to maintain the gardens, and his house still exists today, and you can actually go there and tour it, and a lot of artists like to go and sit in his garden and paint where he painted almost, well, at least 100, almost 200 years ago. So it's kind of a cool legacy that he left, and it's really awesome that a lot of artists can still go and sit where he sat and paint the same plants and nature scenes that he painted. So for our project today, we are going to do a Monet inspired picture. So if you have paint, you can use paint. You don't have to use paint, you can just use something colorful. So any pastels or crayons or watercolor pencils, whatever you feel inspired by, and some paper and an art mat if you are going to be using something messy. So if you want to sit by a window and draw or paint what you see in nature outside your window, or if you just have like a favorite flower or tree in your mind that you want to paint, you don't necessarily have to be looking at the object that you want to paint. Okay, so right now it's dark outside, so I'm not going to be able to look out my window, but I have felt very inspired by the flowering cherry blossom trees that I've been seeing around lately. And this is one of the best years that I can remember, because normally when they flower it always rains and knocks all the flowers off, but they've actually managed to stay on for quite a while this year. So I more want to capture like the mood and impression of the trees than try to make them look really realistic. So I want to think about the colors. So I'm going to use my pastels, and I can use the side of my pastel to get some nice shapes. And I might just do like a quick outline. So this can be just kind of loose and free. And when I have observed these trees quite a bit, I notice their branches grow kind of pointing upwards. And often when you see these trees, you see more than one together because they're so beautiful. A lot of people will either plant a lot of them, or maybe if their neighbor has one, they'll feel inspired to plant one too. And then I can just start making my flowers. So these don't have to look like flowers. It looks more just like a big fluffy burst of pink. So I can just catch the color. So I use the side to kind of create a burst of pink around the branches, and then if I want to use the tip to make maybe some little bit darker, kind of still very loose shapes, but just add a little bit more texture to this. And then maybe I'll use some different greens to show some leafy vegetation on the ground. And again, I can just kind of make some loose shapes here. A lot of times in Monet's paintings, he would use lots of different shades of green. So I'm gonna combine some different greens here. Maybe make like a little meadow or field that these trees are in. And if I use the side of my pastels, I can also just blend some of these greens together. So I like this picture. Spring is also a time when lots of other flowers start to bloom, so maybe I'll add some little impression of flowers. These don't look like flowers, I'm just kind of making some squiggly lines, but they're kind of controlled, so they do give the impression of flowers in my opinion. Some art critics might look at this and think it's terrible, but if they did, then I think I would have really captured the idea of Impressionism well. Okay, so there's my Claude Monet inspired spring cherry tree picture. So thanks for watching my video. I hope you like this project, and happy Impressionist creating.